American women in the 1950s and 60s were limited in many aspects. Anne Sexton sought to even the playing field for women's equality. Through confessional poetry, she would eventually educate all of America on subjects such as abortion, menstruation, adultery, and drug addiction. Sexton's work suggests that she wasn't a stable person and was constantly struggling for happiness. 8 years after winning the Pulitzer Prize, she committed suicide by gassing herself in her garage with her car on. After carefully analyzing Sexton's poems, Her Kind, The Truth the Dead Know, and Sylvia's Death, critics can conclude that her work was a tragically confessional truth. Anne Sexton was an American poet who began writing in the 1950s through the 70s. Famous for provocative and audacious poems about women's issues and concerns. She suffered throughout most of her life from mental and emotional problems. What started out as therapy writing for Anne soon became her published work. The style of writing she's most known for is confessional poetry. Confessional poetry demonstrates the innermost thoughts and feelings expressed through poetry about the author themselves. The poem Her Kind, works such as Her Kind, The Truth the Dead Know, and Sylvia's Death illustrates Sexton's anguished feelings about death and women's role as housewives. She received much criticism for her contemporary style of confessional poetry, but is quoted in 1969 proudly stating, "I hold back nothing." The poem Her Kind is about comparisons between different women and their lifestyles. There are 3 characters in this poem. I will go ahead and read it for you now. I have gone out a possessed witch, haunting the black air, braver at night, dreaming evil. I have done my hitch. Over the plain houses, light by light. Lonely thing, 12-fingered, out of mind. A woman like that is not quite. I have been her kind. I have found the warm caves in the woods, filled them with skillets, carvings, shelves, closets, silks, innumerable goods. Fixed the suppers for the worms and the elves, whining, rearranging, and disaligned. A woman like that is misunderstood. I have been her kind. I have ridden in your cart, driver, waved my nude arms at villages going by, learning the last bright roots, survivor, where your flames still bite my thigh, and my ribs crack where your wheels wind. A woman like that is not ashamed to die. I have been her kind. This poem, again, discusses the comparisons between different women and their lifestyles. The 3 characters were the first one being a witch, which is possibly compared or associated with alcoholism and being adventurous. The second one was a domesticated housewife, which Anne hated most. The third was an adulteress, which was a position that Anne admired most in Her Kind. Her Kind suggests that she didn't like the domesticated role of a housewife when she compared it to the other titles that she had once played. Both of Anne's parents died in 1959. The poem The Truth the Dead Know was dedicated to both of them, despite the allegations of her father sexually abusing her and her mother being an alcoholic and not having much to do with Anne. I'll go ahead and read that for you now. Gone, I say, and walk from church, refusing the stiff precision the grave, letting the dead ride alone in the hearse. Is it June? I am tired of being brave. We drive to the Cape Fear, Massachusetts, that is. I cultivate myself, where the sun gutters from the sky, where the sea wings in like an iron gate, and we touch, in another country people die. My darling, the wind falls in like stones, from the white-hearted water, and when we touch, we touch entirely, no one's alone. Men kill for this, or for as much. And what of the dead? They lie without shoes, in their stone boats. They are more like stone than the sea would be if it stopped. They refuse to be blessed. Throat, eye, and knuckle bone. Again, this poem was for Anne's parents, who died in 1959. The poem reveals stages of grief that Anne felt from the death of her parents, that she reveals through her childhood on into comparisons of comparisons of their death and the cave that they visited when she was a child. The third poem is Sylvia's Death. This is another poem that Anne dedicated to a good friend of hers, Sylvia Plath. Plath committed suicide in 1963 at 31 years old by gassing herself with her kitchen stove. The poem reads, "O Sylvia, Sylvia, with a dead box of stones and spoons, with 2 children, 2 meteors, wandering loose in the tiny playroom, with your mouth into the sheet, into the roof beam, into the dumb prayer. Sylvia, Sylvia, where did you go after you wrote me from Devonshire about raising potatoes and keeping bees? What did you stand by? Just how did you lie down into? Thief, how did you crawl into? Crawl down alone into the death I wanted so badly and for so long. The death we said we both outgrew, the one we swore on our skinny breasts, the one we talked of so often each time we drowned 3 extra dry martinis in Boston. The death that talked of an analysis and cures. The death that talked like brides with plots. The death we drank to. The motives and then the quiet deed. In Boston, the dying ride in cabs. Yes, death again. That ride home with our boy. Oh, Sylvia, I remember the sleepy drummer who beat on our eyes with an old story, how we wanted to let him come, like a sadist or a New York fairy, to do his job, a necessity, a window in a wall or a crib, and since that time he waited under our heart, our cupboard. And I see now that we store him up after year after year, old suicides, and I know at the news of your death a terrible taste for it like salt. And me too. And now, Sylvia, you again, with death again, that ride home with our boy. And I say only, with my arms stretched out into the stone place, what is your death but an old belonging, a mole that fell out of one of your poems? O friend, while the moon's bad, and the king's gone, and the queen's at her wits' end, the barfly ought to sing. O tiny mother, you too, O funny duchess, O blonde thing." Like I said, this poem is dedicated to Sylvia Plath. Sexton, the poem implies that Sexton was envious of Plath taking her own life. It also suggests that they had made a promise to each other to not commit suicide, despite their emotional and mental stability that they never seemed to be able to grasp. Sexton knew it was inevitable when she wrote this poem. You can hear her say, "What is your death but an old belonging?" Again, Sexton wrote this poem in grief for a good friend and as a form of therapy for her. Sexton composed many confessional poems that contributed to the foundation of American literature. Success in confessional poetry was most likely contributed to her emotional and mental instability. Sexton's expressions of sex, death, and womanhood caused much uproar in the 1950s and 60s. Thankfully, she was courageous enough to produce work like that, because many women and people with mental and emotional instability nowadays have something to relate with. Thank you.